Thanks everybody for coming back to the Dalton Collective. Today we have Erik Newton. Erik, can you give us an introduction about yourself and what do you do these days for work?
Wow. What don't I do? I that's almost a cop-out answer. I'm the chief operating officer at Tlon. Tlon is a for-profit company that's the primary developer of Urbit, which is an open source uh, server stack, which you probably know lots about if you're listening to this podcast. Um, and as COO at Tlon, I run finance, legal, people for the most part, facilities, and these days marketing and communications as well, which is why I say, what don't I do? But the truth is I don't do most of it myself because I have an amazing team.
Cool. And so in your past, you are a lawyer, right?
Yeah.
You've done podcasts, and now you're sort of in this crazy startup world. So could you walk us through some of the things that you did in the lawyer and podcasting space too?
Sure. So let's see. When I first got out of law school, was pretty convinced I would never practice law. I was just going to law school for an adventure, a naive adventure, but an adventure nonetheless. And I moved to San Francisco because I'd always wanted to live here and ended up needing to make money. And as a result, hung out a shingle and started up a law firm with no experience, which was a pretty crazy thing to do. And it worked out. And it worked out because I found an amazing mentor who basically guided me through all of my initial cases so I didn't make any huge mistakes. And he was a divorce lawyer. And I really never thought that I'd be a divorce lawyer, but here I was with this extraordinary opportunity and this great guy who was guiding me through the process of becoming one, and so I did. In San Francisco, you really have to specialize as a lawyer in order to make it work. So I dropped into that specialty, and it turned out I was pretty good at it, if I may say so. Um, I cared about the people less than the money. And so I did good work, generated a good reputation. Eventually, we became the largest and also fastest growing family law office in Northern California. So that's something. Ultimately, I lost the firm because my partner was embezzling from our clients, had to pay it back. In the process of paying it back, lost everything. I still can't say that without chuckling because it was so awful at the time. And now it just seems so funny. Um, the great thing about it, I can elaborate on that if you actually want to hear about it. But the great thing about it was, I just, in the end, probably needed to stop being a divorce lawyer, but wasn't going to do it because I was making too much money.
Hmm.
I was basically addicted to it wasn't exactly easy, but it was working. So I wasn't, I had some inertia. Um, but anyway, I was forced out of it, which was a good thing. And when uh, when when all the sort of chips fell and the thing was done, and I was looking back on the mess and also what had come of it, the good and the bad, and trying to decide what to do next, um, it was pretty clear to me that I just didn't want to be a lawyer anymore. That lawyering, that the skill of being a lawyer is very useful for lots of things, but the distilled version of it, actually practicing law, is a kind of it's adversarial, right? Everybody knows that law is about it exists in an adversarial context, but it's the distilled version. It's the distilled version of that adversarial process that uh, some people thrive on, and I just hate it. It's just not for me. So I knew how to build that kind of a law firm, but I didn't want to do it again. So instead, I started a podcast about relationships, which went really well. The podcast was it was a personal project. I never expected to really make a business out of it, but it grew pretty big. Um, we put out, I think, 150 episodes or something. Also had a website that went along with it that sort of was kind of like a quasi magazine. I had journalists writing about relationships, and I had therapists writing about, relationship skills, that kind of a thing. Um, but ultimately I knew that I needed to do something that was going to make money fundamentally. And I'd been into Bitcoin early and had a real taste for crypto. I'd acted as general counsel for an early privacy coin, so I was in the space a little bit. And I thought, well, if I'm going to do something to make money, I want it to really matter. I wanted to I wanted to feel as if I'm actually contributing to the benefit of human society, not just jacking off to get rich. And the so there were really only three categories that were interesting to me um, in the startup world, and it was crypto, but good crypto, AI, and quantum computing. And AI and quantum computing were just beyond my reach. So I looked at a lot of crypto companies. Most of them were scammy because this was 2017, and one of them was not scammy. And they made me an offer, and here I am.
That's pretty cool. And for people listening, this podcast is for a particular group, the Dalton Collective, which is a collective of individuals looking to make community a vital part of their life, but also make money, which is why I wanted to talk with you, and why everybody in the group actually was really interested to hear what you have to say. Because like some of the things you were talking about in your legal practice and even in your podcast and even on through your more call it crypto career, relationships have been a very much a part of what makes those successful.
Yeah.
And so uh, relationships aren't always easy, right? So especially if anybody who's listening to this has been married, and you think at the very part when you first get married, this is going to be great, it's going to be, love and roses for the rest of your life, but you quickly figure out that it's maybe a bit more complicated than that. So what I'm getting at here is conflict is an inevitable part of any relationship that matters. Maybe not
Yeah.
if it's just a casual relationship, but in the Dalton Collective, we're interested in deep, fundamental relationships with other human beings, which means there's going to be conflict. And so you have some interesting perspectives, I think, and insight into some examples of people who have gone through some amazing conflict and
Mm.
come all the way back around. So could you tell me about some of those times in your practice in family law where it seemed like all was lost, and then something else either turned it around, or a perspective or a mindset or a practice of dealing with conflict
So
changed that perspective. Yeah.
you want to get kind of philosophical here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, then let me. Okay, I have some stories that, I mean, of course, I was a divorce lawyer, so I have stories, and also the podcast, 150 couples who told me things that I never expected them to about their personal lives. So I've got stories for sure, but there's, but let's talk about the broader concept of conflict
Hmm.
first, because it's, uh, I, my mentor in the divorce practice always said nobody ends up a divorce lawyer by accident. And, that was a bit, I wasn't sure what to make of that. But when I was looking back on it, I realized that for me, divorce law was a way to explore my parents' divorce and the conflict that arose out of that and the impact that it had on me as a kid. And it was a way to get really up close and personal in this intimate way with actual, honest, no holds barred, for real conflict. Not not the wisdom that people generate after the conflict is over when they're trying to look good and tell you what they learned about it, but actually be right there in it with people. And it's dirty and it's messy. Um, and I think being a therapist and maybe being a divorce lawyer are the two most direct ways to be involved in that as somebody other than the parties. And man, it was really, really rough. And it was rough at first because I couldn't get myself out of other people's conflict. I made their conflict my conflict. And
Mm.
eventually I learned how to create a barrier there, a healthy one, and still empathize with people and still work with them, but not make their problem my problem. And once I did that, I started to formulate some thinking around conflict that then carried into the podcast and then some writing that I did about the issue. And it's fundamentally what all distills down to is that um, it's not so much that you can't avoid conflict as that the essence of relationship in some sense is actually the conflict.
Hmm.
Now, this requires an expansion of the concept of conflict. So, you could argue that it's a bit de minimis, but nonetheless, um, the way I see conflict is fundamentally it's where one thing bumps up against another. It's where one agenda meets another agenda.
Hmm.
One viewpoint, one set of values meets another viewpoint, another set of values. And no two human beings ever have the same viewpoint or set of values or agendas, ever, ever, by definition, or else they'd be the same entity. And that would be, of course, quite boring. So, so you've got two people coming into a relationship, and invariably there's going to be edges that bump into one another. And that is actually fundamentally, that's the nature of experience. Like that is what experience is. Experience is noticing where concepts and ideas and values and people meet up and bump up and touch one another. And that's conflict. And some of that conflict is just the feeling of, your one finger touching another. Or some of that conflict is just, working out where you want to eat dinner if there are different places. But some of that conflict is deep. Some of that conflict is about stuff that came out of childhood that's never been resolved and is probably never going to be resolved. And, um, and, but you can't ever get rid of it entirely. You can deal with the pain. You can have a more mature and um, sophisticated way of incorporating the lessons, but you can't get rid of it. And you shouldn't seek to, because it's the essence of the whole thing that you're after. What what I always found in the romantic relationship context is that people say they want intimacy and they say they don't want conflict, but actually you can't get to the intimacy that you say you want unless you go through the conflict. Because the intimacy is that feeling that you get of connectedness when you understand the other person's deepest, most messy problems, values, etc. And you can't just kind of understand those on a surface with somebody that you really care about. You have to get into it, and that means you have to engage with it as it impacts your own values. So you can't even get to this thing you say you want if you don't go through this thing you're trying to avoid. So you can't avoid it. You have to go through it. That's
Hmm.
all there is to it. Okay, so that's the big picture, but then it always comes down to how the heck do you actually do that?
Hmm.
And there's, uh, innumerable tools and lessons and etc. that we can talk about around that. But fundamentally, the big picture is don't even try to avoid it. Just deal with it, use it.
Yeah. And I'm thinking in a group context where we want to be, or we at least profess that we want to have this some level of intimacy that's larger or deeper than just sort of surface. So when we do experience these things as we are moving into those conflicts, right? Maybe tying it into some other kind of general experiences that we're having right now, which is sort of distributed relationships, right? Distributed work,
Mm.
distributed family. Everybody is on the internet these days. We're having this conversation. I mean, we would have had it over the internet anyway. But so when we're trying and we're striving for intimacy and we're experiencing conflict, what are some of the ways we can sort of deal with that when we don't necessarily have some of the tools we might be normally used to, which is to say face contact, or even, quiet spaces for meeting, that kind of thing? What can we do in this sort of new distributed era, or at least
That's
what's
an
your intuition?
I think it's the same tools it always was. It's just, through this other medium. You know, there's there's basically one tool. I think there's one tool. If you learn nothing else in the relationship skill set, whether it's romance or work or whatever, learn this one tool. And that's fundamentally the tool of mirroring. People call it different things and you can use it in modified versions, but fundamentally it's mirroring. Do you know anything about how
No,
mirroring
tell us.
works?
Tell us, what is this?
All right. So basically it's this. Um, Communication consists of uh, the perception on the other end. Let's see, I think I can distill this. I was about to go down a rabbit hole that's probably not worthwhile.
Hmm.
Basically, you want people to know that you understood what they said and that you don't think they're crazy. That's really what it comes down to. You want people to get that you heard them and you think it makes sense.
Mhm.
That's That's fundamentally what it's all about. So mirroring is this very stretched out and very detail-oriented technique or process by which you repeat everything that somebody has said until they're satisfied that you said it the way that they need for you to say it, so they know that you heard it,
Mhm.
basically, right? Like you just repeat stuff back, and then the person you're repeating it back to is the arbiter of whether you repeated it properly. And some couples therapy sessions start with just months of just practicing mirroring until you can do it without being a jerk. It's pretty hard to do without being a jerk because you always want to reinterpret it or judge it or say or like justify it, because a lot of times something that if somebody in a romantic relationship, somebody might be saying something that feels accusatory, so you want to defend yourself or tell them why they're incorrect. But no, you just got to repeat back what they said until they're satisfied that you heard them. And it's the same thing in the professional context. Now we've got this video medium that sort of limits the ability to ensure that you've been heard or that you've communicated what you intended to. And so it's even more important to practice the basic technique of just repeating back what the person said until they're satisfied that you heard them. And you can't do it. You can't do it too aggressively in a business meeting, but you got to do it to a degree. You and I are in meetings all the time.
Mhm.
And I'm curious if you notice me doing that. When you say something that you've done on a given day, I try to repeat it back and make sure that I understood it and that you understand that I understood it. Have you noticed me doing that?
I have, and to the point of there, you have a particular way of doing it, which is almost verbatim,
What is it?
right?
What do I do?
So, like, if I say, and I want to, and I'll just say it, and then you'll literally repeat the thing that I just said. And just when you say, the act of mirroring it back, right? And the way you deliver it, meaning it's what I just said and it felt right the first time I said it. So that's how I know that you've heard me.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Okay. So the way of me repeating it and the way you've delivered it, I just totally screwed it up. I was trying to do it. It's
What are
pretty
you going to do?
embarrassing that I couldn't do it live. But anyway, yeah. So, but it actually does matter to you that I repeat back what you've just said. That's how you know that I said it or that I understood it.
Hmm. And,
Okay.
and something else actually that you do that, just for everyone listening here, is um, so that not only do you repeat things. One thing I've noticed is that not only you repeat things so that I know that you've heard it, but your reaction to things when you have got it, and you know that I know that you've got it, are like strong and immediate. Does
Ah,
that make sense?
interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah, that does make sense.
which I
Strong
find
and immediate.
very strong and immediate feedback on the level of communication that's happening.
Oh, well, now I want to know, how is that distinct? Well, what would it be like if that were absent?
Well, sometimes in a normal conversations, let's say in a normal business conversation, you might be talking about something you're working on, and you might feel like you've got some good communication here, and then the conversation either moves on to another topic without much feedback about whether the thing you just discussed was on target or
Hmm.
appropriate, like whatever it is. You just sort of like, yep, we finished that. Now we're moving on. Like there's
Yeah.
no yes. What I mean by that is some people are very good at communicating, like, yes, that is it. We're good, and now we can move on, which actually has an effect on the person doing the work or presenting a work,
Yep.
right? Which I think is important.
Okay, that makes sense. So, okay, well, that leads me to something else. So right now we're on a tangent from, what are the fundamental communication skills that you need in this distributed context that we're living in today? And my answer to that is, well, you need to be able to repeat back what people just said to you.
Mm.
So use mirroring. And pro tip, if you're in a relationship romantically, practice mirroring all the time. It will save your relationship. Um, but another thing that I like to do is what you just said. I like to, after I've repeated something, put a period on a sentence so that people know where we stand in the context of that conversation, and then pull an action item out of it.
Mhm.
And it's whether I'm speaking up or down the chain of command. That's what I like to do to create clarity, because then people know what to do. I find that in a lot of meetings, particularly over video, people don't know what to do afterwards. They just sort of meander around. And so right, you've got a like quick and immediate response to something that somebody has said, and then pull an action item out of it, and then get agreement on the action item. When I get to that point, by the way, Kenny, I like to ask people to repeat back to me what I just said, because a lot of times people won't do it automatically.
Hmm.
So if we pull an action, you've said something, I pull an action item out of it. I say, okay, great. So that means after this show, you're going to write the show notes and send them to me. And then I'll
I'm
be
going to write
like,
the show notes and send them to you.
exactly.
There we go. We got it.
Great. I'll look forward to that.
Cool.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway,
Yeah.
right. Practice mirroring. Fundamentally, if you can just do that one thing, you're going to be fine in communications.
That's good. All right. So let's change topics a little bit and kind of look at, so in your legal practice, and then there's a lot of things that go into being a lawyer, not just any one specialty. So it's a fairly broad, way of being and thinking. And then some of your experience with crypto specifically, there's always been this idea of, for a very long time, there's been the idea of a decentralized autonomous organization,
Mm-hmm.
right? But possibly a new kind of thing that's maybe a little bit different than what we normally would consider legal organizations or incorporations. But the question here is that the Dalton Collective is yet to be incorporated. Right now, it's just a group of people talking about things on the internet. We don't have any other responsibilities or revenue or anything like that. So actual legal organization is less important right now. But when that time comes that we do need some kind of organization, legal organization. So in your career that you've seen with these people organizing on the internet, trying to do interesting things, and your legal experience about like legal persons, where do you kind of see this stuff headed?
Whoa. Oh, I thought you were going to say, what's the best form of entity or whatever. And I was going to tell you that I'm super rusty and I don't really know anymore, except LLCs are pretty good for, flexibility, whatever. But
Mm-hmm.
that's pretty boring stuff. Where do I see it going is anonymity.
Say more about that.
I think that where we're headed, I think that there are so many overlapping regulatory regimes
Yeah.
and jurisdictions that all claim to have authority over individual people and organizations that they're part of, that most normal people can't make sense of them anymore, even the well-intentioned ones. And of course, we see this in crypto specifically, and falling out of the whole ICO craze. For sure, there were some scammers, but there were a lot of really well-intentioned projects that were just trying to create value for all the right reasons, but were blocked by various regulatory entities like the SEC.
Hmm.
And the thing, and you've got to give credit to the SEC too. It's not as if the SEC is some nefarious arm of the one world government that's trying to dominate our lives. They really are just very educated people trying to do the right thing using laws that are frankly a little outdated.
Hmm.
And it takes a long time to change laws, and it takes a long time for people to understand how laws should change. And we all know this. I'm just singing a song you've all heard before. By the time they do figure out how to change those laws, the realities of what's happening in business and business logic have moved on, and now the new changes are outdated. So I think really the best solution for very, very risk tolerant or very, very out of the box entities or projects is full anonymity and distributed autonomous corporations and entities. I think that's where it's got to go, so that people can take risk and try to innovate value. And if it works, they can figure out how to capture that value. They can use that value to become compliant. And if it doesn't work, let it go without facing regulatory hurdles. Now, as a lawyer, I'm not allowed to tell you that you should break the law. And if I understand you're going to break the law, I'm supposed to report it. So don't break the law. But yeah, I think anonymity and distributed organizations are going to be the wave of the future. And if you can figure out a way to do that with existing technologies, I say go for it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So that kind of leads us into another topic, which is to say identity in general on the internet.
Mm,
So when you say, I think anonymity is a way of moving forward in a legal framework, at least until there's maybe some revenue to become compliant, if so needed. Reputation seems to me would be vitally important to make that work. And right now, there is no reputation system out there that is either owned by the individual who has that identity or can be moved around in any sense freely, right?
yeah.
Um, so it seems to me that to make that sort of thing possible, that identity that one can own and sort of is the own, like can move and change and is under your authority is vitally important to something like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, your question is red meat for Urbit fans, obviously, because
Yeah.
what we've what we've designed here in part is a pseudonymous identity system that's cryptographically ownable by the end user. And that makes possible exactly what you're suggesting. Now, it's early days and it's not entirely secure yet, so I don't know that it's useful for making a fully distributed, autonomous, and anonymous DAO that has high value assets included inside of it. But the general point is right. I think we're the only credible project. We're the only credible project that I know of that is creating a substrate for identity to be used for reputation to accrue around pseudonymous identities. And so specifically pseudonymous identity, I mean, everybody listening to this probably knows, but what it means is there's no anonymity here. It means that a pseudonymous identity is an identity that's not necessarily associated with a particular human being, but has its own reputation on a given network. And so, as you said, it can go out and it can engage and transact with people based on that reputation, the reputation that it's accrued over time in that context, not necessarily the reputation of the human being that's behind it. And in fact, it might not even be one human being behind it. It might be multiple human beings on a multi-sig that are behind it.
Yeah.
And that opens up a whole lot of possibilities. And before you ask the question that I see is on the tip of your tongue, I'll say one more thing about it, which is people's criticism of this is often that pseudonymy, the anonymity leads to bad behavior. Our response is that pseudonymy leads to good behavior, because pseudonymy means that reputation still matters. You do still have to behave well in order to to extract the value from that reputation. And so there you have it. Good behavior.
Yeah. And to just add one small thing to that is the way the Urbit identity system was designed was that it wasn't also free, right? Meaning that yes, you can accrue identity, but in order to boot up a new one, there's at least some level of friction, probably small, but enough that you can't just sort of spam the network with these sort of fake identities as well, which is
Yeah.
important.
Yeah, which is important. Yeah.
So, but I do want to kind of round things off here with Urbit specifically, because this is a somewhat Urbit centric podcast in the sense that the Dalton Collective is based in Urbit for a reason.
Yep.
It's based there because we can't do what we want to do anywhere else. We can't hold assets. We can't move things around. We can't build reputation. We can't communicate without all of that thing, with all that layer with being absent, meaning we can't do that with all these little third-party applications and things like that.
Yep.
So Urbit itself is sort of becoming an ideal platform for communities specifically. And in the course of our conversation, we've been talking about relationships and skills and communication and even sort of legal ways of some doing things. But let's talk more about Urbit and communities specifically. So in the course of your work at Tlon, building the tools that make this possible, why is it important that we have communities in the first place?
Do you mean why is community important to human beings? I don't know if you're asking that, but I
Yeah,
have an answer.
but let's start there. Let's start there, and then we'll move into a digital context. But first and foremost, why is identity or community important to people?
You know, I it's important to us because it's our fundamental survival trait. It's not, and it's so fundamental to who we are that it's not that we have community. We are community. There is no way to extract who and what each of us individually is from the context of our greater community. We are creatures of we are creatures of that community. We're fish, and we are fish to the water of community. There's no understanding us individually without community. But the reason that it's so fundamental is because it's, cooperation is the mechanism by which we survive, period.
Mm.
And then so that's at its essence. And by the way, that's where, um, all my thinking around conflict and cooperation comes from as well, is that fundamental need for us to engage with one another in a cooperative way to even survive. We don't
Mm-hmm.
have teeth and claws the way, you know,
Mm-hmm.
other animals do. So, it, but then and then that manifests in all of the, millions of different ways that it does, in the business context. And what I love about it is that there's so much variety. It can arise any way you want. I mean, it can or why it can arise in the most efficient way. Um, it arises in the way that is most efficient for its purpose. Bureaucracy is a kind of community that's perfectly efficient for a very large and very critical element of infrastructure. For instance, you need a deep and rich bureaucracy with lots of procedures and people who follow those procedures to a T if you're going to be working with critical infrastructure for a large community. And you can have a DAO for something that's weird and completely not yet understood and very speculative, so that it can be very nimble and very autonomous and very pseudonymous. Anything, humans can adapt and create any kind of community that they need for a specific purpose, is my whole point. But what are you trying to get at about more micro communities here?
Well, I think what I'm getting at with communities like Dalton, um, is that we have a lot of infrastructure and a lot of ways of doing these already. You mentioned one, meaning the institutions that we currently rely upon for critical infrastructure. That's one way of doing it. But we have new technology, and as things have been coming at us faster and faster, we have new tools, and they make sort of different things possible. And I'm wondering, now that we have something, or like Urbit seems to me is just so perfect for being able to build communities like we haven't been able to build before. And so the question is, was that intentional? And do you see this being like the primary use case for Urbit?
Oh, is it the primary use case for Urbit? It's certainly the current paradigm. I think the primary use case for Urbit is something that we haven't even ourselves understood yet.
Hmm.
I think Urbit is the um, base level architecture for a kind of cooperative computing that we don't quite understand, and that the next generation will build. We're
Hmm.
building the base layer for them. They're going to build on top of it and make something really useful. But right now, the current paradigm is definitely communities, groups. It's groups.
Hmm.
Uh, the idea being that we live in a networked world, um, and yet the architecture for all of our systems is based in pre-networked systems. And why wouldn't we build architecture? Why wouldn't we build systems for a networked world, a world where people want to compute together? And so that's, we find that in the kernel architecture, but we also find it in the interface design. The interface currently is all designed around how do groups come together and work together, and um, how should all of the modules and functionality be laid out, given that that we're thinking about this in terms of groups. Uh, but what's going to be done with that, I don't think we know yet.
Okay, that's fair enough.
Yeah.
So I know that so Talon is different than Urbit. Um, so could you just sort of also give us, for the listeners who might not know or be aware, what is the kind of the difference there?
So Urbit is a open source software program essentially. It's available for anybody to see on GitHub. You can fork it. You can do anything else, anything you want with it. Please come contribute to it. It's an open source project.
Hmm.
Tlon is a for-profit company that happens to be the primary developer of Urbit. There are many developers of Urbit. There are some other for-profit companies that are developers of Urbit and a whole bunch of individual contributors. Tlon was just the first of the companies that did that, and so we're the biggest and the most well-funded at the currently. Um, and I think, do you want any more detail around that?
No, I think that's pretty straightforward. And so, as the COO of that company, what are some of the plans that Talon has moving forward, and how does that relate back to Urbit?
So, we're working on a couple of initiatives currently. One is to deepen the stability and speed and security of the underlying architecture, the kernel, the operating system itself, so that other people can build on top of it and do so at scale. Two, we're working out our proprietary, well, it is proprietary now, but we'll eventually open source it, interface that you can use to engage with the operating system. And we're constantly iterating on that interface, trying to make it better, cleaner, more intuitive, more beautiful. Um, our approach to it is to keep it very, very simple, very utilitarian, you might say, very much as much a blank canvas as you can for other people to build on top of. Um, as of today, it's pretty hard for other people to add on to it, but we'll make it easier as time goes by. That's one of our core initiatives for the next version. And then, though I already mentioned this, we think of it as a separate initiative. We're working on making the entire platform secure. So, the identity system is a set of smart contracts that are built on top of Ethereum, and those have been audited and they've been stress tested and battle tested, and they are secure. But Arvo has never been audited, and we need to probably do a little bit more work before it could pass a sufficiently robust security audit. So we're doing that work now, scoping what that audit will look like, and we're going to have an audit by the end of the year, which will result in an entire system that is so secure that people can really trust putting their private keys inside of it and knowing that they'll be safe as long as they don't lose their own access keys or give those up. So so that's the three initiatives. It's harden the base layer, make the interface way more rad, and make the entire thing secure. And we are leading the charge on all of that because, as I said before, we're the primary developers of the open source software. But again, anybody can contribute to it. I mean, the software is, you can go take a look at it if you want to, if you're sophisticated enough to be able to read it. And if you want to learn how to do that, you can come to us, and we've got programs that'll, like Hoon School, it'll teach you how to code in our programming language. We've got plenty of documentation and lots of people that are very happy to help you get up to speed if you want to get involved.
Well, that's a great. I think that's a great way to end the episode. So, Eric, is there anything else you wanted to mention before we close things up here?
Urbit.org, that's the first place to go for sure. Tlon, we have a website. We do actually have a website. It is one page. I think it has pictures of our faces, and that's it. So you're not going to find much information there, but tlon.io is that website. And I forgot to mention, eventually Tlon will be offering hosted Urbit experiences for people who don't want to run their own servers. They want to run them in a hosted environment so they can access them through a web browser or for a client on any device. And you can probably find information about that hosted service at tlon.io when we put it up on that page.
Excellent. All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kenny. Cheers.